Good evening, everyone, and I hope you can all hear me. Yeah, great. And I just want to say thank you, first of all, very much to the CCI for the opportunity to return. I had a wonderful time here last year, completing a novel and living in these wonderful circumstances and surroundings, and very much welcomed and taken care of by everybody here. So I want to say a big thank you, and how happy I am to return, and this evening to present you with something of the project, something about the project and about the work, the very sort of fruitful and creative time I had here. So I'm beginning with this figure, this beautiful portrait we have here. And can I ask, am I introducing the figure of Elizabeth Bowen to the audience, or have people read her work or read about her, know of her work? Some people, yes. Anybody? Am I introducing her to the first time for some people? Good. Great. That's good. So we have a kind of those who are interested to find out more, and that's perhaps those who've already read Elizabeth Bowen and would like to maybe hear more about her. So to begin, I wanted to really talk about the fact that where we're sitting and standing here, very close to us in 1946 in the Luxembourg Gardens, an Irish woman and a Canadian man met on a regular basis to walk, to smoke together, to have lunch and to talk. Why do we know this? Because, well, we have their letters and their diaries. And why were they in Paris? Why were they so near us? And what were the circumstances of their relationship? Well, I think that was a very good starting point. The woman was, of course, Elizabeth Bowen. And the man she was meeting daily was a Canadian diplomat called Charles Ritchie. At that point, Elizabeth Bowen would have been in her mid-40s, a celebrated novelist, short story writer, critic, and broadcaster. And Charles Ritchie, who was some years younger than her, was a young and successful diplomat. He had studied in Oxford and had lived in England all during the Second World War. And they were both in Paris for the Paris Peace Conference. Elizabeth Bowen came as a journalist, unusually. She was accredited to the Cork Examiner because she wanted to be in Paris. I don't think she ever wrote for them before or after that. And obviously Charles Ritchie was working as part of his work. They met because they had an intense, yet in many ways fractured relationship. They were lovers. Elizabeth Bowen was married at this point, had been married for over 20 years, and she and her husband Alan lived in London. There, during the Blitz, Elizabeth Bowen and Charles Ritchie had met for the first time, and their love affair, which really was part of the war, part of their time living in London, continued after the war. So let me give you a little background, first of all, into Elizabeth Bowen herself, and perhaps maybe my own reasons for kind of getting interested in her. I put together, amongst other things I do, I write fiction and biography and memoir, but I also write in literary criticism, and one of the things I do editions of writers that interest me. And what interested me in putting this book together, I put together a collection of Elizabeth Bowen's Irish writings, her essays and journalism and broadcasts about Ireland, partly because of the perception, particularly in Ireland, that at that point, that Elizabeth Bowen wasn't in fact truly Irish. The idea was that she was someone who had written about Ireland and occasionally in her work, but that perhaps her work was belonged to a sort of perceived mainstream of 20th century English fiction. And I wanted to really challenge that idea. So one of the things I did is I collected everything she ever wrote about Ireland. And I discovered that she had written extensive reports, secret reports, for the Ministry of Information in London during the Second World War. I'd known of this, but then I decided to actually collect them. So I went to the National Archives in Kew and got them. It's not quite clear how they survived. They were supposed to be confidential. but they did actually survive and were in existence, and I got permission to reproduce them in this book. Because I was interested in looking at Elizabeth Bowen as an Irish writer, and then the notion of Elizabeth Bowen as someone who was involved in some degree in espionage. Now, was she or was she not involved in espionage? This is one of the questions I want to sort of address tonight. All writers are spies. I'll be using every detail of this evening, probably in a brilliant novel at some point. So you're all, please feel free to sue me liberally and have the book banned and then make it even more successful and sell a few more copies. We all use, if we write, we use every aspect of our lives, and we shamelessly cannibalize all around us, and that's the way it should be. Because, as Graham Greene said, every writer has in their heart a sliver of ice. So Bowen was a writer who was, of course, interested in her own life and drew upon her own life and her own background. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But she was also involved in espionage, both in her life and then in her fiction. So this is one of the things that drew me to her. Okay. A little bit about Elizabeth Bowen and her background. Born in Dublin, although she had very strong connections with Cork and with particularly North Cork and the family home Bowens Court, which is next to the hardly tiny little village of Farrahy, very near to Kildorrery in North Cork, very beautiful part of the country. She was born in Dublin. Her mental breakdown and illness had been plagued the had plagued the family, Elizabeth Bowen's parental family, and her father grew very ill. He'd been writing a book about the reform of land reform in Ireland, and at one point he got so impatient with his book he picked up all the pages and threw them out the window, and they fluttered into the canal in Dublin. I can understand how the poor man felt, but he suffered. He was very ill. And Bowen and her mother went to live in England all throughout her childhood. Bowen therefore said that she felt all her life English in Ireland, Irish in England, and only at home on the Irish Sea. So her life was partly one of exile, one of displacement, and one of what she called herself a kind of a unlocated identity. That was partly through her personal circumstances, the loss of her father, his illness, her mother and herself, they were devoted to each other, sort of in flight. But also it was partly her sense of being Anglo-Irish, different, apart, in an Ireland that was changing rapidly all throughout her childhood and early youth. So she recovered, but tragically her mother became ill and died much at the same time, 1912. And this loss was crucial to Bowen, who writes greatly about orphaned or motherless children and about adolescence. She was sent to boarding school in England. She trained briefly as an artist, but in fact was most interested in the writing of fiction. In the First World War, she was at Bowens Court. Bowens Court survived the First World War and the War of Independence and the Civil War. And Bowen herself then married in 1922, at the same year that she published her first collection of short stories. It's a picture of Bowen. You can't really see in the background. It has some of the landscape of North Cork. Okay, she married her husband Alan Cameron, settled in Oxford. Then her first collection of short stories was published. Perhaps her most famous Irish novel, Last September, published in 1929, but she had many successes through the 30s, including perhaps her most successful, The Death of the Heart. Also The House in Paris, a novel I should mention, perhaps my favourite of all her novels, a wonderful novel about the past and the present. 1939, Second World War broke out, and Bowen volunteered to provide confidential information to the Ministry of Information. Now, for this work, Elizabeth Bowen was paid. She had a connection through her friend Lord David Cecil, whose brother was part of the cabinet. And it's known that one or two of her confidential reports made their way as far as Churchill. She was delighted to know this. Bowen's friends in Ireland didn't know about this reporting. Her friends in London did. She discussed it with, amongst others, Virginia Woolf. And it gave her access and a possibility to return to Ireland at a time when it was difficult to travel between England and Ireland. And it gave her a sort of a reason to work between the two. During the war, she wrote her family history, Bowens Court, and she went back to Bowens Court itself to research it. And she talked about the fact that for her, that house, the house that she inherited, her family home, had in some way become for her the symbol of peace and survival when she was in London, living through the Blitz. And some of her best short stories, some of her best prose pieces come from her time in London. So Bowen continuing to live between the two countries, but experiencing in London a sense of energizing, a kind of imaginative vitality. She and her husband both volunteered and had various duties. Their house indeed their flat in London was bombed a number of times and eventually destroyed. This is Bowens Court. As she said herself, not particularly spectacularly beautiful or large or elegant house, but for Bowen it meant a great deal. Partly I think she writes so well about its landscape and the idea of a house living in such a landscape. She has a wonderful image of the house like hers, during a house in Ireland during the War of Independence, talking about the frightened house and the countryside being the unwilling bosom whereon it was set. So often for Bowen, the houses themselves express that sense of fear, that sense of loneliness, and that sense of longing. And Bowen writes beauty about landscape and about light, and has that particular quality. So Bowens Court was very important to her, particularly during the Second World War. But she and her husband lived in Clarence Terrace, just on Regent's Park, and remained there, living there all through the war. Her novel, The Death of the Heart, is partly based there. And it was here in Clarence Terrace, sometime in 1940, that Elizabeth Bowen met with Charles Ritchie. Now, he was 7 years younger than her, had studied in London, or in England, had a great deal of family and connection there, and was very popular in that world, and they began their love affair. And they began to keep, both of them were keeping diaries, Bowen not so much, but Bowen was certainly keeping her letters. So we have quite an extensive record of that relationship, partly through Charles Ritchie's own diaries, and partly through the letters that Elizabeth Bowen sent to him, and that he kept, and that he used later again in publication when they were published. Well, he didn't use them, but he allowed them to be used side by side with his diaries. So this wartime relationship is one that we know a great deal about. We know it partly through the fictions of Elizabeth Bowen. Again and again, she writes about this sense of wartime and love affairs in the wartime. She talks about the landscape of London. She has a wonderful story called Mysterious Core, which is about a young couple wandering around London with nowhere to stay, nowhere to sleep, nowhere to be together. And they go wandering in a landscape flooded by moonlight that looks like that they're the only ones there, that it's somehow been deserted by everybody else. So Bowen writes again and again about the landscape of London during the war, and always contrasting with the landscape of North Cork. Oh yeah, this is a portrait I like. It was painted a little later, before the loss of Bowens Court. Now, this is her quote. Years after the war had ended, she was bringing out an American edition of her short stories, many of which were set in London. And this is what she says. I felt one with and just like everyone else. Sometimes I hardly knew where I stopped and someone else began. The violent destruction of solid things, the explosion of the illusion that prestige, power and permanence attached to bulk and weight left all of us equally heady and disembodied. We all lived in a state of lucid abnormality. And for Bowen, this was an incredibly creative time for her as a writer because of what she saw as this lucid abnormality. It was partly her love affair, and it was partly the sense of living in a city where instantly life could end. She talks about the thinning of the membrane between the living and the dead. My theory is that Bowen, all her life, felt dislocated, or unlocated was her own word, unstuck. Times of violence and disturbance made Bowen feel, for once, part of the universe that she inhabited. Now, Bowen, I think what made her a writer was the sense that her writing made sense, made a kind of reason out of this world that she found herself in. I think she wrote out of that sense of being unlocated. But wartime upheaval, the idea that permanence is impermanent, this somehow stimulated her even more. And I think this gives a particular quality both to her writing, her letters at the time, and I suspect to her relationship with Charles Ritchie. But more about that. Elizabeth Bowen in Espionage. What does that really mean? Well, she wrote a series of reports about Ireland, really to be read by the British establishment. Bowen really wasn't in a position to conduct any significant espionage. She had very little access to any politician of note in Ireland. She attempted to see Eamon de Valera. This will come up in something I'm going to read you now in a while. She did have afternoon tea with Archbishop John Charles McQuaid, a very influential political figure, but he managed to keep the conversation on the teaching of domestic science in the schools for young women in Dublin at the time, something that Bowen was even less interested in than he was. She had no real access to military knowledge. So what she did really was she sort of gathered what she could of public opinion, conditions of the country. She was attempting in some ways to use her novelist skill to present the texture of Irish life during the Second World War, and particularly the question of neutrality. And what Bowen said, for example, here is, I could wish that the English kept history in mind more and that the Irish kept it in mind less. What's interesting is Bowen positioning herself between the two. She sees herself as neither English nor Irish. She talked about the Second World War as a time where England and Ireland turned faces towards each other, distorted and unrecognizable to their lovers. So in other words, Bowen sees herself as the lover of both countries, but not in fact of one or the other. What she'd make of the current relationships between the two countries, I think, would be pretty similar. So Bowen sees herself as neither English nor Irish. Bowen sees herself as an interpreter of Irishness to the British establishment. So what she sees that she can do is in somehow mediate between the two, because in her reports, she wants the British government to understand that Irish neutrality was necessary and justifiable. She saw it as an assertion of sovereignty and a necessity for peace and stability in Ireland, and at a time when this would have been something viewed very negatively in Britain. Spying, espionage also turns up in Bowen's wartime novel, The Heat of the Day. Now, I won't spoil it for you because some of you will have read it, some of you will, I know, go rush out and buy it as soon as I'm finished, so you should. But at the beginning of the novel, a question is posed whether one of the central characters is or is not a spy? And this question remains unanswered until the end, and partly takes a trip to Ireland and a visit to an Irish big house and a sense of the Irish belief in the Allied side and the Irish support for the Allied side of the war, that somehow this brings clarity to this question. But the other interesting thing I should point out, there's a picture of Charles Ritchie, who published his wartime diaries, including some of them written here in Paris. And he's actually an excellent writer. If any of you get a chance to read him, I'd recommend his work. He has a turn of phrase. I've only read his diaries. I haven't read his other work. But he was an excellent diarist, knew many people. This novel, The Heat of the Day, was produced, as I say, by Bowen's wartime experience. It's a novel about spying, it's a novel about loyalty, and it's a novel about a love affair. The central characters are to some degree inspired by both Bowen and Charles Ritchie. Although when you read the end of the novel and you see it's very kind of a violent and melodramatic ending, you do wonder what Bowen was doing with that relationship. But in many ways, the relationship with Charles Ritchie is mirrored in the novel. The novel also was a very important part of Bowen's wartime life. She wrote it all through the war. In fact, as her house was in Clarence Terrace was being hit and damaged, and finally they were bombed out, she was sending chapters of the novel into the country for safekeeping. So as her furniture and all the kind of heavy material things, she saw them all as disappearing. What mattered to her was the manuscript, the pages themselves. And she sent them out. But the novel wasn't published until after the war. It was published in 1948. It was dedicated to Charles Ritchie. I've always thought this is remarkable, given firstly that Elizabeth Bowen all through the war lived with her husband Alan Cameron in Clarence Terrace, where Charles Ritchie was openly received as what? I don't know. This is partly what my novel tries to negotiate. How in private do these things, how are they accounted? How are they created? The fact that the novel is dedicated to Charles Ritchie, I think, is quite remarkable. There was a film adaptation of the novel with Patricia Hodge and Michael York, a TV adaptation, a very good one in the 1970s. What's even more remarkable is the fact that it was dedicated and published to Charles Ritchie in the year he married. In fact, he married his cousin. And the sort of fact of that marriage is something that I write about in the novel and something that I deal with. And I wanted to question, okay, so that's kind of the background, I suppose, to the work that I was doing. So having in the past worked on Elizabeth Bowen from a critical point of view and as a researcher and as a literary critic, I got this idea of writing a novel about her. And I wanted to write a novel about the writing of The Heat of the Day. I wanted to write a novel about her wartime experience. And most importantly, I wanted to write a novel based on the publication of her letters and Charles Ritchie's diaries in a collection called Love's Civil War, which was, I think, his phrase for their relationship. Because what happened between Elizabeth Bowen and Charles Ritchie was that a wartime connection, a wartime affair, of a time where death was imminent, where the permanence of everyday life was always being fractured and somehow being unraveled. This wartime affair somehow became a lifelong connection. And this is really what I write about in the novel, and this is what I try and imagine. So what I did in my novel was I took the perspective of the four major characters in the novel, and I gave them each a chapter. So obviously Elizabeth is the or Bitha, as she was known to both Charles and to Alan and to her family. Elizabeth is the central sort of character, but she doesn't, in fact, I don't give her every chapter as the kind of central consciousness. Charles Ritchie, I was always interested to see how he viewed her. When they met, he was a younger man. She was a celebrated writer. When he saw her, he commented afterwards, she looked like the kind of woman who was very good at playing bridge, which I think isn't the most alluring comment of a would-be lover, but he did fall in love with her very much. In one of the letters, in one of his diaries, he talks about the discovery of how incredibly beautiful her body was. And I mean, it was clearly a very passionate love affair. So I gave 1 or 2 chapters to the perspective of Charles Ritchie himself. In fact, the novel opens and closes at the same moment. So I also give a chapter to the perspective of Alan Cameron, Elizabeth Bowen's husband, who befriended Charles Ritchie. And Charles Ritchie was received in their apartment in London and visited Bowens Court, not at the same time as Alan. A large framed photograph of Charles Ritchie sat on the mantelpiece in Clarence Terrace all through the war. And then I was very interested to know what Charles Ritchie's cousin and wife thought of all of this. She had been befriended as a younger woman by Elizabeth Bowen. And then when they married, Bowen refused to speak to her again and never met her again. So jumping ahead a little bit, Elizabeth Bowen continued living and working in London. Then she and her husband Alan retired to Ireland in 1952 to Bowens Court. Alan Cameron died suddenly, sort of unexpectedly, and although through the 1950s Elizabeth Bowen struggled to maintain Bowens Court financially. It was a time when many houses in Ireland were going. It was a time of high immigration. And Charles Ritchie, now married, living in Bonn and then in Canada, was becoming more and more successful. He ended up being Canadian ambassador to the United Nations, to Washington, got to know Kennedy, many people like that, and was highly valued. So he and his wife were traveling, living around the world. All through that time, he continued to visit, see, meet with, and correspond with, and be the lover of Elizabeth Bowen. In fact, they spent time in New York. I think they spent some time in Paris. And they always stayed in connection. As she ran out of money, he always offered and helped her financially. And then eventually she sold Bowens Court and moved to Oxford, and then finally moved to Kent, where she died in 1973. Charles Ritchie was at her deathbed. She lost her voice in the last last days of her illness, and she wrote him a poem on her deathbed because she couldn't speak to him. And he and her cousin sat with her and drank champagne, and he was at her funeral. And then he continued to be a successful, many years as a successful diplomat, lived on right into the 80s. So this is what I did in my novel. I open in early 1980s. Charles Ritchie is now an elderly man, and I began through the voice of Charles Ritchie himself. This is the only part of the novel that's first person, and it also ends with him, begins and ends with him. And his wife is still alive, although she's very ill, and in fact he outlived her. And Elizabeth Bowen is dead for many years, and he's now in retirement in Canada. So this is how I opened the novel, about 1980, I think. Elizabeth, I woke at 4 this morning calling your name, shouting it out into the empty bedroom. You had just left, or so it seemed, your presence in the dark room still palpable, your departing spirit waking me up. Up, fully awake, despite all the whiskey, and I thought, so I'm still alive. I wondered if I should feel grateful. Now I lie here and watch for the first touch of light to creep along the edge of the curtain and wonder why I'm not dead yet, like you, dead all these years. It seems impossible that you're dead. It seems that you've just left, or was I dreaming? All I want to do is dream of you while I lie here and wait for the dawn. My dream, it's very simple. The roses in Regent's Park, a summer's day, you lying on the grass, smoking gracefully, telling me all about your latest book. my dream of you, of us. I had another dream last week. Rows of your books on a shelf before me. I stood before them thinking, Bitha, if I read them all, would I find you? Or was I the flaw in your story? You were always stronger than me, the deadly strength of the writer, telling our story, our dream of each other, my dream of you. So I wanted to start with that idea of Charles Ritchie looking back all the years, and what I should have been a wartime affair became something for him eventually that dominated his imagination. And we know this from his diaries. I won't give away the final line of the book, not my book, but of the collection of his diaries and letters, where he comments on their relationship. But one of the things I was interested in writing about was the effect on him. Because in many ways he had the upper hand during their relationship, because she fell completely in love with him. Okay, this is from a later scene. This is 1941, and this is been told from the point of view of Elizabeth Bowen herself. So this is one of her chapters where it's her voice. And she's in London and writing and working and living with her husband, and she's got to know Charles Ritchie, but has no idea what his intentions are, what her intentions are, but she's become more and more interested in this man. In late April, with a sudden feeling of imminent resolution hanging in the air, she walked past the National Gallery, glorying in the endless light of the bright early summer evening, when she heard her name being called. It was Charles in a taxi. He waved at her to stop and got out. What good luck, he said. I finished early today and was going to call into Clarence Terrace. Time for a drink? They strolled up Regent Street together, silent for once. Usually they could talk for hours, but this unexpected meeting, the bright sunlight, the glances they darted at each other, all this made new territory. They found somewhere for a drink, and after some hesitation, he suggested staying on for dinner. At one point, she phoned Alan to discover he had returned from work, and she told him she might stay at Angela's for the evening. She wasn't sure. He told her crisply to enjoy herself, but Alan hung up before she could say goodnight. When she got back to the table, Charles told her about a small nightclub nearby, where he sometimes went to drink in the late evenings, and they walked there. Now, conspicuously together, this made her even more tongue-tied as they listened to the small band play. A loud table of 10 or so people in full evening dress sat right next to them. In their midst, a woman near her own age, with pale blonde hair and a worn look, sat with a small fox fur slung round her shoulders. As the evening progressed, she realized that this woman kept looking at them. Finally, Elizabeth mentioned it to Charles. Charles, I do believe we're under surveillance. He glanced around and caught the eye of the woman sitting at the edge of her large party, their table right next to them. She was expensively made up with an unfinished drink before her. Her companions were talking around her, but no one seemed to be talking to her. She kept drawing on and off her oscillate gloves. As she did, she glared over at Charles. He shrugged and turned back to Elizabeth. An unpleasant thought crossed her mind. A spurned lover? Was this her future? Do you know her? Never saw her before in my life, he shrugged. As they chatted, the party across them began standing up, somewhat to Elizabeth's relief, as the malign glances of the woman became more and more overt. The woman started gathering up her gloves in her bag, tugging her fox fur more tightly around her. Then, swaying on her feet, she walked towards them. Charles looked up but stayed sitting where he was. I just want to say, young man, she began, in a soft, whispery kind of voice, her face hesitant, somehow unfocused, that you should be ashamed of yourself not to be in uniform. She stopped. Her hair, expensively peroxide, seemed to quench her pale face, made her seem transparent. Charles sat impassively staring up at her. The woman shook off the arm of an older man who had come up behind her and was attempting to draw her away. Charles sat smoking, his eyes fixed on the woman, his gaze unruffled. The woman turned towards Elizabeth. A look of real venom came into her face, tightening her mouth, her real prey now in sight. And as for you, at your age, Charles cut across her, quietly sharpening, you were disturbing us. The woman stopped. Elizabeth wondered how the woman could stand there so calmly. Charles' long, handsome face was now transformed by a look that froze off all conversation by full force of his expression. He turned back to Elizabeth and asked gently, "Another drink, darling?" The woman in the foxfire looked as if she was going to strike him. He stood up very quickly and faced her from his greater height, and she stumbled back a step, her companion using the opportunity to take her arm and draw her away. Charles turned to the waiter. "2 more cocktails, please." They drank in silence, both unwilling to discuss the unwelcome intentions of the woman. Darling. He had never called her that before. "You know," she remarked, more for something to say. "That was unpleasant. But these days I always feel that there's a third always sitting at our table with us." Charles looked at her quizzically. "You mean Alan?" "Well, no, actually, I meant the war," she replied. She paused and decided to be blunt. "Well, you know, as far as that goes, Alan and I have our separate ways. Always have." He nodded. "I presume so," he said. He stood up. "It's getting late. I'll fetch you a taxi." She stayed sitting. So this was it. She had made it as clear as possible, and he wanted to leave her. Something wintry growing within her chest made her want to sit and stay where she was. "I don't want to go home. You go if you like." He stared at her, and for a moment she thought, "Charles, break my heart, but don't waste my time." Instead, he took her hand and drew her to her feet. Outside, the night had crept upon them, blazing with an intense moonlight. The street outside brilliantly illuminated as he took her hand again and kept it firmly within his. "Where to?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "Not Clarence Terrace, anyway. And not my place," he added. "My cousin Sylvia is coming to stay." Right. Now, if I have time, just one last short piece with your indulgence. Is that okay? Yeah, it's a very short piece. But I like it because it's based in the Shelburne Hotel. A place I've never stayed, but I felt in the interests of creativity I should really have gone and stayed there. But I've had afternoon tea there, which I suppose is as good as it got. Okay, 1942, so we're a year on. It's at the Shelburne Hotel in Dublin. Elizabeth slips out of bed to watch him sleep and, taking a sheet of paper, begins a letter to him. "My darling, my darling, my darling." She pauses and holds the pen aloft. The hotel room is warm, the strong sunlight creeping along the heavy velvet curtains. Charles lies there free of sheets, clasping a pillow within his thin, strong arms, sleeping with a kind of concentrated intensity, his face soft and vulnerable without his dark-rimmed glasses. It's just past 7 o'clock, and already she can hear doors opening, and closing along the corridor, a trolley wheeled along, making floorboards creak. She's afraid that he'll wake up, ending this precious moment of contemplation, but Charles sleeps on with complete absorption. She continues to write. "To turn from everything to one face is to find oneself face to face with everything." With a sheet wrapped loosely round her, she sits in a comfortable, deep, comfortable chair at the end of the double bed and continues her love letter to him, a letter she can never show him. "For me, it's as if we have walked a new country together. Each place has become ours alone and never just mine." She stops. A light knock on the door. She pushes the letter under the chair and creeps over to fetch in the morning tray. Charles stirs and murmurs but pushes his head under a pillow, determined to sleep. With her coffee beside her, she takes up her letter and continues. "Death has surrounded us from the start, but somehow because of this, the accidental miracle of our meeting is made even more precious. She's startled to see that he's woken up and is smiling at her. Why the frenzy, he laughs. She stops herself from covering up the letter. Oh, just some tedious business. The ministry? Well, more of a love letter, actually. She risks a joke as he seems less and less interested. To Churchill, I suppose. And he yawns. She nods, wondering as if he would insist on reading the letter. Yes, I do confess I admire him dreadfully. David told me that Winston read my latest report himself, or had some of it read to him at any rate, and said it was a pleasure to have something so lucid for once about Ireland. Still, he didn't change his mind about De Valera, I'm afraid, despite all my pleadings for the Irish. He yawns again and pushes away the sheet. Forget about De Valera. Come back to bed.